I have been working on a memoir. I guess we're all working on memoirs here. My agent recently told me they were the hardest things to sell, so oh well. But I posted a quote on our Facebook site this morning that, God, I wish I had it in front of me now because I want to read it. But it was from Mary Carr, and she said something like, writing a memoir is like punching yourself in the face if it's done right. And it's kind of how this whole process has felt for me. My story covers a 6-year or 5-year period of time from the time I was about 19 years old, and I was a straight A student at a pre-professional Seventh-day Adventist program in California, fundamentalist and very buttoned up, and had no idea who I was. I was just following the family script for a variety of reasons involving my past and my family's past. I felt that I had to. And the story begins with my cracking up in that setting and just not being able to do it anymore. Going home. I see Amy is here. Amy Lovelace is here tonight, and she was witness to that whole thing. So I'm happy you're here, Amy. And then the story takes place over the next several years as I tried to figure out who I wanted to be and rejected sort of layer by layer the programming that I'd received, which is pretty hard because in my family, as in Kate's, I think, rebellion was not really tolerated so well. So I had to do it through a series of what I call portholes or portals, not portholes, that's on a ship, portals or doorways in the form of men. And so the whole narrative is kind of structured around these relationships with men, you know, each one transformative in its own way, each one eventually turning into somewhat of a trap, so that I had to go on to the next one. And the part I'm going to read tonight takes place in the last relationship, towards the end of the story. This is after I've been through a whole lot, but my group told me I had to read it, so sorry. And this is with Jimmy. And I kind of want to dedicate this to Jimmy, who died a few years back. Getaways are hardly ever as romantic as we want them to be. I'd been picturing mine for weeks now, dreaming about soaring solo through the desert with my sunroof open, my music pulsing, the dry wind swishing through my windows. But when the time finally came on a late June Friday in 1988, I found myself stuck in traffic in an unexpected drizzle, escaping California by inches between the bumpers of pissed off commuters. My car waited with things that weren't even mine. My passenger seat taken by a man I barely knew. I'd met Jimmy just a few months earlier. He was my coworker at the Metaphysical Bookstore, a writer, an aspiring actor with a slow sideways grin and moony azure eyes who introduced me to Rumi and taught me to see the spirits of desert trees. Jimmy believed in my writing too. So when I was finally accepted to an MFA program in Amherst that May, and when he offered to drive me back east, it seemed like an obvious yes. He was well-traveled, he knew the Southwest. He could be my tour guide, I reasoned, trying to tamp down the protest in my head. I can't remember much about our scenic ride from Flagstaff down to Sedona, except that Jimmy drove, as he liked to. I don't know where we ate that afternoon or what we did besides linger at a phallic rock formation where Jimmy meditated for 20 minutes, insisting it was one of the spiritual vortexes. He pleaded for a lengthy detour too, a hike to some old Sinagua Indian ruins, and I had grudgingly acquiesced. So after 2 hours of hiking through the desert, when we finally spotted the crumbling ancient walls of a native cliff dwelling high up in a deep gash on the canyon wall, I had to pause. The sun was inching behind towering red swells of rock, and clouds flashed like broken glass in a tangerine sky. The whole canyon just flamed with energy. Here again was that wild magnificence, that pulsing, timeless intelligence that both embraces you and finds you irrelevant. So it was that I climbed the high cliff face and entered the cave dwelling behind Jimmy, every cell gasping as we stared at the blazing spectacle around us. We must have stood there half an hour while the sunset played out an increasingly flamboyant act, outdoing itself. And the wind whipped silently over rock, reminding us that these were the same sights and sounds the inhabitants must have seen and heard 3,000 years ago. A mourning dove hooted twice beneath the soprano trilling of desert birds. And finally we stirred as the quarter moon crested the canyon's edge, a waning wedge in the pale lavender sky. It's almost dark, I observed, coming out of my stoned and reverential trance. Yeah. Well, how are we going to get back? Do you think we can make it in time? I don't know. I was like so bewitched, he said. We stared at the vanishing trail, remembering the steep sunlit paths as if we had climbed them eons ago. Miles of slippery shale, sharp rocks, and cacti on either side. The journey out is always so much easier and more compelling. Time after time, I have found myself just like this, exhausted in the fading light, grimly contemplating the way back after being propelled farther than was wise. Coyotes cackled, too close for comfort, as Jimmy walked the perimeter of the cliffside dwelling, marveling at the mortared stone walls, the scrawls in the rock, the ancient tracings of a people who were somehow at one with all this wildness. I guess we better spend the night, he said, sliding his hat off and grinning. Here in a cave? It'll be awesome. But we don't have a flashlight or any water. I was trying to keep the panic from my voice. I was trying to keep the beneficent pink glow of the canyon inside my skin, but the show was over. Darkness had fallen like a stone. It was chilly, and all I had on were capris and a cami. I untied the cotton button down from my waist and slipped it on. It's okay, Dorji, it's okay. Yeah, I forgot to say, Jimmy called me Dorji because G is a Hindu suffix that connotes affection and respect. Anyways, sorry. It's okay, Dorji. I still have water in my canteen. We can sleep here. He pointed to the soft dirt floor of the cave. Other people's have. Right. And who knows what happened to them? Still, I did feel it, the draw of this place, the deep pull to lie on the ground where some ancient family had made their home, the whole nighttime desert sprawling below us. Also, we didn't really have a choice. Give me a sip of that water, I said. Before long, we were shivering and Jimmy made a teensy fire from the wad of receipts in his pocket, a few cigarette butts, meager scraps of wood. Then he finished off the roach in his pocket. The ground was cool and solid beneath that 2-inch layer of silt, and try as I might, I could not get comfortable sitting on it. We made a game of remembering old church hymns, which led to Jimmy talking about his big, affluent Southern Baptist Florida family, his war hero father, and the 6 beautiful, suffocating sisters, the country club set, he called them. He talked about the debutante balls, the wealthy older women who had tried to seduce him at the dinner theater where he'd been a singing waiter, how serenely disappointed his parents were when he dropped law to pursue an acting career. I studied him in the sputtering light of our little fire, imagining him in tennis whites or church clothes. I'd never seen Jimmy in anything but t-shirts and Salvation Army pants, his safari hat, his friendship bracelets. But now I could picture him cleaned up in a suit, and it struck me that he looked a lot like the men I'd grown up with. Suddenly, it all made sense. Jimmy and I were cut from the same cloth, a couple of wayward kids from wealthy conservative families trying to eke out a little independence, a smidgen of authenticity against all odds, like the camel squeezing through the eye of the needle. Jimmy, like me, had rejected his ordained path. He'd set off bravely to do something different, and now here he was, a 38-year-old bookstore clerk who'd sublet his shitty apartment to come wandering through the desert with me. He had no car, no property, no wife or kids. His family no longer offered assistance, aside from the occasional birthday or Christmas check from a wealthy older sister. I suddenly felt sickened and too cold. Our teeny fire was waning, and beyond it, just past the rim of the cave, a darkness loomed deeper than any I had ever known. The wind whistled through the canyon in rhythmic gusts like black ocean waves, and I could hear soft scuttling noises too, though I didn't want to think about what was causing them. So, do you think you'll ever go back? I asked through chattering teeth as more coyotes pricked the silence with their lonesome yip wails. Back to LA? Yeah, I'm going after you get settled, after we find you an apartment in Amherst, right? Unless you want me to stay, he smirked. No, I mean home. I mean, do you ever think about going home to Florida? Oh, sure, he said, as if this were a given. You'll go home too, Dorji. He curled onto his side now, shoving his metal canteen under his head for a pillow. After you've had a few more adventures, he said. Maybe. I dragged my bare toes through the powdery dirt, wondering if this, then, was the difference between us. For Jimmy, this was all a grand adventure, a fascinating excursion from which he knew he'd eventually return, battered but basically unscathed, to claim his birthright. Right now, though, this is home. He yawned, waving a hand to indicate the blackness around us. Don't you want to lie down? He said, and before I could answer, he'd fallen asleep. I tried lying beside him, but I could not get comfortable on that hard dirt, couldn't settle into this makeshift bed, though every part of me ached with exhaustion. Every atom longed for the warm oblivion of sleep, the safety and comfort of home. I thought about home, wondering if my mother was awake now, worrying, and what she'd say if she knew I was with some middle-aged actor type in the middle of the Sonoran desert. I pictured her tight, worried face last I'd seen her, how she'd gripped my shoulders hard and said, "You won't come back. I just know it. Also, you need some air in your tires." Of course I'll come back, I'd laughed uncomfortably, brushing her off. Mom, stop it. Haunted now by the memory of her stricken face, I tried pressing my back against Jimmy's breathing back. I tried spooning him and being spooned. I pulled his heavy arm over my shoulders, counting. I counted the number of houses we'd moved from, the number of schools I'd left, the number of men I'd abandoned. In a way, I'd been practicing the art of leaving for years. I'd left school and church and family and now state, broken up with this boyfriend and that one and that one. Suddenly, it seemed like my whole life had been about trying to fill or flee some ancient loneliness. And now, here it was. The familiar old loneliness had found me out despite all my attempts to outrun it. Or maybe I'd been trying all along to make peace with it. A bat fluttered inches over my head and then several more. I screamed and bolted upright, tried to shoo them away, but my movements must have roused the rest from their hiding, because all at once the cave was just thick with bats, alive with their leathery wings. They swirled like leaves in a Santa Ana wind. They glanced off the sun's stone ceiling and swooped through my hair. And as if their flurry demanded some echo, I started running around the cave with them, beating my arms like a crazy person, like someone got mad with fear or sorrow. To this day, I don't know if I was trying to scare them or join them. One bat hit me square in the forehead, and I fell, curled into a ball beside Jimmy, covering my head and telling myself to breathe now, just breathe. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the cave grew quiet. Through all this jostling and screaming and thrashing around, my sweet, stoned tour guide just kept on snoring, one arm thrown over his head as always, the other clutching his canteen. His stingy fire gone out, the last ashes dispersing in the bracing wind, I sat up and watched his sleeping face. It was amazing that he was right here next to me, and yet a universe away, oblivious to my struggles. For all his trip ticking and map charting, for all his gentle Buddhist guidance and earthly male wisdom, I knew Jimmy couldn't help me now. I also knew I wasn't going to sleep this night. I was more awake than I'd ever been. I got up and walked to the lip of the cave, stared eastward at the beaded black expanse of the horizon. There were more stars than I knew existed. I could make out the bright angles of Cassiopeia, Ursa Minor's kite-like tail, and I remembered the nights my grandmother and I had stood at the edge of her wide lawn looking east toward the constellations. I thought about my grandparents, my great-grandparents, all those people who came west in wagons or on horses, who made beds on the ground as a matter of course. All those hardy, stubborn people who'd left their homes seeking purpose or clarity or freedom. Was I made of the same stuff? I didn't think so. Still, I'd always been in love with their grit and their audacity and their ability to go off in search of their lives, leaving everything wrong and familiar. Was it just my late night imagining? Or were they with me now, nudging me none too gently toward my future? They were not the kind of ancestors to soothe or cajole. They had no real comfort to offer, aside from a kind of fierce inevitability, the inescapable knowledge that my path was out there in the darkness before me. And then the startling question, what if I could only discover it by myself? What if I needed to be alone just now? After years, a lifetime really, of being named and molded and rescued and silenced and judged, what if I needed quiet, acres and acres of quiet, hours and days to hear my own thoughts again, weeks to become whatever it was I was becoming, crazy or mean or selfish or broken or wise? It must have been about 3 a.m. by then, and my body had stopped shivering. Another bat or two meandered into my personal space, but I barely flinched this time. There was nothing left but to welcome all this cold and echoing brightness, the chill wind, my companion's thick snoring, punctuated by coyote banter. I don't know if I dozed a little, but my mind finally quieted, like a palm opening to receive what was given. My mind slowly extended, and into it was placed a single nugget of faith. When the sun rose that morning, unapologetically bright, and my companion finally stirred and sputtered, I knew what I had to do. Jimmy stretched and rubbed his face for a while. Then he smiled at me and said, "See, that wasn't so bad now, was it, Dorji?" Thank you, everybody.